The dust hung thick in the parched air of Ash Fork, Arizona, as Nora Clarke stumbled forward, her wrists bound tightly with rough hemp rope that cut into her skin. The year was 1881, and the merciless summer sun beat down on her uncovered head, her honey blonde hair falling in disarray around her tear-streaked face. She could barely keep her footing as Marshal Benton and his deputy, a wiry man named Dawson, dragged her through the town's main street toward the small wooden jailhouse that doubled as the local court of justice. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "I didn't steal anything. You have to believe me." Her pleas fell on deaf ears as townsfolk stopped to stare, some with pity in their eyes, others with the cruel curiosity that misfortune tends to inspire. Nora had arrived in Ash Fork just 3 days prior, seeking work as a seamstress after fleeing a difficult situation in Prescott. At 22 years old, she had learned the hard way that a woman alone in the West was vulnerable to all manner of accusations and mistreatment. Now, she was being hauled to face the town justice on charges she couldn't comprehend. "Save your breath, woman," Marshal Benton growled, tightening his grip on her arm. "The Millers say they caught you red-handed with their silver. That's good enough for me." "But I was only delivering their mended clothes," Nora protested, stumbling again as they approached the weathered steps of the jailhouse. The lawmen pushed her roughly toward the entrance, Deputy Dawson reaching for the door handle when a shadow suddenly darkened the doorway from within. A tall figure stood framed in the entrance, broad-shouldered and imposing in a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. His face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his Stetson, but his stance left no doubt about his intentions. He wasn't moving. "On what charge?" The deep voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Marshal Benton stopped short. "Get out of the way, Yates. This doesn't concern you." The man stepped forward into the light, revealing a sun-bronzed face with a strong jawline softened by remarkable blue eyes that assessed the situation with unsettling clarity. Yates Valentine had been in Ash Fork for only 2 weeks, taking odd jobs at local ranches, but he'd already earned a reputation for keeping to himself and asking few questions. Until now. "I asked you a question, Marshal," Yates said evenly, his gaze shifting to Nora's terrified face, noting the bruise forming on her cheek where she'd clearly been struck. "What crime has this woman committed that warrants such treatment?" Deputy Dawson's hand hovered near his holster. "She's a thief, caught stealing from the Millers. Now step aside." Nora shook her head frantically. "I didn't steal anything. Mrs. Miller asked me to mend their linens and shirts. When I brought them back, Mr. Miller said a silver snuff box was missing. I've never seen it, I swear." Yates didn't move from the doorway. "Do you have proof, Marshal? Witnesses other than the accuser? Did you search her belongings?" "We don't need to explain ourselves to a drifter," Marshal Benton spat. "The law in Ash Fork is my business." "The law should be everyone's business," Yates replied coolly, "especially when it's being mishandled." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Yates spotted the town's actual justice of the peace, Mr. Holloway, making his way toward the commotion with a concerned expression. "What's happening here, Marshal?" Holloway called out, his scholarly appearance at odds with the dusty frontier town. Benton's grip on Nora loosened slightly. "Caught ourselves a thief, Judge, taking her in for sentencing." "Sentencing?" Holloway's eyebrows rose. Without a trial or hearing, Yates used the momentary distraction to step closer to Nora. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. They wouldn't let me gather my things. Everything I own is still at the boarding house." Holloway reached them, slightly out of breath. Marshal, you know the procedure. If there's an accusation, the defendant must be given a proper hearing. The Millers are important people in this town, Benton protested. If they say she stole, then they can present their evidence in a civilized manner, Holloway interrupted firmly. We aren't vigilantes here. Yates still hadn't moved from his position between the lawman and the jailhouse door. The lady says she was delivering mended clothes. That sounds like an easy claim to verify. Holloway nodded. Indeed. Marshal, I suggest you release Miss Clarke, Nora supplied, finding her voice. Nora Clarke. Miss Clarke into someone's custody until we can hold a proper hearing tomorrow morning. Benton scowled. And who's going to take responsibility for her? You, Judge. Before Holloway could respond, Yates stepped forward. I will. The crowd murmured with interest. Nora stared at the cowboy in disbelief. You, Benton laughed harshly. A stranger vouching for another stranger, not likely. Holloway considered for a moment. Mr. Valentine has been doing honest work for the Peterson Ranch. I've heard no complaints about his character. He turned to Yates. You understand this means you're responsible for ensuring Miss Clarke appears for her hearing tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I understand, Yates replied solemnly. Benton looked ready to argue further, but Holloway's position as Justice of the Peace outranked his authority as Marshal. With visible reluctance, he untied Nora's wrists, leaving angry red marks behind. Tomorrow at 9, he said, pointing a finger at her face. And Valentine, if she runs, it's your neck in the noose. Yates didn't dignify the threat with a response. Instead, he gently guided Nora away from the lawman, aware of the curious stares following them down the street. Thank you, Nora whispered, rubbing her chafed wrists. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Yates kept his eyes forward, scanning the street with habitual caution. I know what it looks like when someone's being railroaded. You said your things are at the boarding house, she nodded. Mrs. Peterson's place. But I don't have money for another night. I spent my last dollars on supplies for mending. Then we'll retrieve your belongings and figure out the rest after, he said simply. Can you walk all right? Nora straightened her shoulders, determined not to appear any weaker than she already had. Yes, I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Valentine. For the first time, a hint of a smile touched his lips. Just Yates will do. As they walked toward the boarding house, Nora felt the weight of the town's scrutiny. They're all staring at us, she murmured. Small towns feed on gossip, Yates replied quietly. By supper time, they'll have us either plotting to rob the bank together or running away to get married. Despite everything, Nora couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her lips. Neither seems particularly likely. No, he agreed, his expression unreadable. But at least the second one wouldn't land us in jail. When they reached Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, the older woman met them at the door with evident relief. Oh, Miss Clarke, I heard what happened. Such nonsense. I was just about to come to the jailhouse myself. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, Nora said gratefully. I need to collect my things. I'm afraid I can't afford to stay another night. Mrs. Peterson waved away her concern. Nonsense, child. I wasn't going to charge you when you're in such trouble. Besides, I know you didn't take anything from the Millers. That man has always been too quick to accuse when things go missing. Yates, who had remained respectfully silent, asked, Has this happened before? Mrs. Peterson lowered her voice conspiratorially. 3 times in the last year. First he accused one of the ranch hands of stealing a watch, then the blacksmith's boy of taking coins from his desk, and now Miss Clarke. The watch turned up in his other coat pocket, and the coins were found under his ledger. And no one thought to mention this to the marshal. Yates asked incredulously. Marshal Benton and Richard Miller served together in the war, Mrs. Peterson explained with a significant look. They're thick as thieves, if you'll pardon the expression. Nora felt a flicker of hope. Do you think Mr. Miller will find his snuff box too? Oh, I'd wager on it, Mrs. Peterson nodded. But that won't stop them from making trouble for you in the meantime. She turned to Yates. It's good of you to stand up for her, Mr. Valentine. Not many would risk crossing the marshal. Yates shrugged uncomfortably at the praise. Just trying to do what's right, madam. Mrs. Peterson smiled knowingly. Well, Miss Clarke, your room is still available if you'd like to rest before dinner. And Mr. Valentine, you're welcome to take a meal with us this evening. After the older woman bustled away, Nora turned to Yates. You don't have to stay. I'll be fine here until the hearing. I gave my word to the justice, Yates replied. Besides, I think we should talk about tomorrow. If what Mrs. Peterson says is true, we might have a defense, but we need to be prepared. Nora nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she felt. Could we talk after I've had a chance to clean up? I feel like the whole town's dust is on my skin. Of course. I have some errands to run anyway. I'll come back for supper if that's all right. She watched him leave, this mysterious man who had stepped between her and injustice without hesitation. Despite the trouble she was in, Nora felt safer than she had in months. Upstairs in her small rented room, she poured water from the pitcher into the basin and scrubbed her face and hands, watching the water turn brown with dust. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror was pale with fatigue, a purpling bruise on her right cheekbone where Deputy Dawson had struck her when she'd initially resisted arrest. As she changed into her only other dress, a modest blue cotton with white piping, Nora tried to make sense of the day's events. She had come to Ash Fork hoping for anonymity and a chance to rebuild her life after fleeing an unwanted suitor in Prescott, a man whose persistence had turned to threats when she refused his increasingly forceful advances. The irony that she'd now found herself in trouble anyway wasn't lost on her. But at least this time, someone had stood up for her. The image of Yates Valentine, standing solid as a mountain in the jailhouse doorway, asking that simple but powerful question on what charge, kept returning to her mind. By the time Mrs. Peterson's dinner bell rang, Nora had composed herself enough to face the evening. She descended the stairs to find Yates already seated at the dining table, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt, though his vest and jeans still bore the marks of hard work. He stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that wasn't universal in frontier towns. "Miss Clarke," he greeted her, his eyes briefly taking in the bruise on her face before politely looking away. "Please call me Nora," she said as she took the seat across from him. After today, formality seems unnecessary. 3 other boarders joined them, an elderly schoolteacher named Miss Winters, a rail company surveyor called Johnson, and a young man named Eddie who worked at the general store. The conversation initially revolved around town news, carefully avoiding mention of Nora's predicament until Eddie, never one for tact, brought it up over the roast beef and potatoes. "Heard you got yourself in a fix with the Millers, Miss Clarke," he said, spooning gravy onto his plate. Lucky Mr. Valentine here stepped in. Marshall was fixing to throw away the key. Miss Winters clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Really, Edward, must you be so blunt?" Nora set down her fork. "It's all right. I have nothing to hide because I've done nothing wrong." "Of course you haven't, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, passing her the bread basket. "The Millers are simply mistaken. I'm sure it will all be cleared up tomorrow." Johnson, the surveyor, looked skeptical. The marshal doesn't change his mind easily once it's set. And Richard Miller has the ear of every businessman in town. Then perhaps it's time someone reminded them that accusations require evidence, Yates said calmly, but there was steel beneath his words. The conversation shifted to safer topics after that. but Nora noticed how Yates observed the others, gathering information while revealing little about himself. When the meal concluded, he asked if she would join him on the porch to discuss the hearing. The evening air had cooled considerably, bringing relief from the day's heat. They sat on the wooden bench that faced the main street, now quiet as businesses closed for the night. A few oil lamps cast pools of yellow light along the boardwalk, and stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. "I spoke with a few people around town," Yates began. "The story about Miller losing things and blaming others checks out. The blacksmith remembers the incident with his son quite clearly." "Will he testify to that?" Nora asked hopefully. "He's afraid of losing Miller's business," Yates admitted, but he agreed to speak up if directly questioned by Justice Holloway. Nora sighed. "I understand his reluctance. Standing against powerful people is dangerous." Yates studied her for a moment. "You've done it before." It wasn't a question, and Nora was startled by his perception. "What makes you say that? The way you hold yourself. You're scared, but you're not broken by it. That comes from experience." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "I left Prescott because a man wouldn't take no for an answer. His family owns half the businesses there. When he became insistent, I had no recourse." "So you ran," Yates concluded. "I prefer to think of it as making a strategic withdrawal," Nora replied with a small smile. "But yes, I ran. And now I'm wondering if I'll need to run again after tomorrow." "Let's focus on clearing your name first," Yates suggested. "Tell me exactly what happened with the Millers." Nora recounted how Mrs. Miller had hired her to mend linens and shirts 3 days ago, how she'd completed the work yesterday and returned it this morning. Mr. Miller had appeared as she was leaving, accused her of stealing a silver snuff box, and sent for the marshal immediately. "Did you see a snuff box at any time while you were working?" Yates asked. "No, never. I worked in their kitchen on a table Mrs. Miller cleared for me. Mr. Miller wasn't even home most of the time I was there." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "That's important. We need to establish where you were in their home and who else had access to the areas you never entered." They discussed strategy for nearly an hour, going over what questions to expect and how to respond. As the evening grew later, Nora found herself growing more comfortable in Yates's presence. Despite his intimidating appearance, there was something reassuring about his methodical approach to problems. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured as their conversation wound down. He hesitated, then nodded once. "Why did you really help me today? Most men would have walked away." Yates was quiet for so long that Nora thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "When I was 16, I watched my mother get dragged off by a sheriff on a false accusation. No one stood up for her. No one questioned it. She died in a jail cell before they discovered their mistake." His eyes, when they met hers, held old pain carefully contained. "I promised myself I'd never stand by and watch that happen to anyone else if I could help it." The simple, devastating honesty of his answer left Nora speechless for a moment. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed. He accepted her sympathy with a slight nod. "It was a long time ago, but some lessons you don't forget." He stood up. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." "Where will you sleep tonight?" she asked, suddenly realizing she hadn't considered this practical question. "I've made arrangements with the livery stable. I'll be back to escort you to the hearing in the morning." As he turned to leave, Nora impulsively reached out to touch his arm. "Thank you, Yates. Not just for helping me, but for believing me. That means more than you know." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or an emotion he wasn't accustomed to acknowledging. "Get some sleep, Nora," he said gently. "Dawn comes early in Ash Fork." She watched his tall figure disappear into the gathering darkness. a strange warmth in her chest, despite the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. True to his word, Yates arrived at the boarding house just after sunrise, having already attended to his morning ablutions. He found Nora waiting in the parlor, dressed in her best and only good dress, a dark green cotton with modest lace at the collar. Her hair was neatly pinned up, emphasizing the delicate lines of her face and making the bruise on her cheek stand out starkly against her fair skin. "You look ready for battle," he observed with approval. "I may not have much, but I know appearances matter in situations like these," she replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. Mrs. Peterson appeared with a basket. "I've packed some biscuits and apples for you both." No sense facing a trial on empty stomachs. They thanked her and set off toward the small courthouse. The town was already coming alive, store owners sweeping boardwalks, delivery wagons making their rounds. More than a few curious glances followed them as they walked side by side. "Word spread," Yates murmured. "Looks like we'll have an audience." Nora swallowed hard. "I hadn't thought of that. Just remember what we discussed. Answer truthfully and directly. Don't let them fluster you into saying more than necessary." She nodded, grateful for his steady presence beside her. The courthouse, when they reached it, was indeed filling with townspeople. Justice Holloway was already seated at his desk on the raised platform at the front of the room. Marshal Benton stood nearby, arms crossed, with Deputy Dawson at his side. The Millers occupied the front row, Richard Miller's florid face set in lines of righteous indignation, his wife looking uncomfortable beside him. Yates guided Nora to stand before the justice's desk, positioning himself slightly behind her right shoulder present, but not presuming to speak for her. Justice Holloway called the hearing to order, explaining the accusation for the record. "Miss Clarke is charged with the theft of a silver snuff box, valued at $15 from the home of Richard and Margaret Miller." "How do you plead, Miss Clarke?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Nora replied clearly, her voice carrying through the hushed room. Holloway nodded. "Mr. Miller, please present your accusation." Richard Miller rose, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit that strained at the buttons. "It's simple enough, Justice. This woman was in our home, supposedly doing needlework. After she left yesterday morning, I discovered my silver snuff box missing from my desk drawer. No one else had been in the house except family." "Did you actually see Miss Clarke take the item?" Holloway asked. Miller huffed. "I don't need to have seen it. The evidence is clear. The box was there before she came, gone after she left." "Did you search her belongings at the time of the accusation, Marshal?" Holloway turned to Benton. The marshal shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, Judge." But Miller was certain. "So there was no direct evidence connecting Miss Clarke to the missing item," Holloway concluded, making a note. Miller's face reddened further. "Are you calling me a liar, Justice?" "Not at all," Holloway replied calmly. "I'm establishing facts." "Miss Clarke, please tell us your version of events." Nora stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Miller hired me 3 days ago to mend linens and shirts. I worked at the kitchen table where she set up a space for me. I never entered Mr. Miller's study or any other rooms except to use the necessary once, with Mrs. Miller's permission. I completed the work and returned everything yesterday morning. That's when Mr. Miller accused me of theft." "And you deny taking the snuff box," Holloway confirmed. "I do." "I've never even seen it," Nora stated firmly. Holloway turned to Mrs. Miller, who had remained silent. "Mrs. Miller, can you confirm Miss Clarke's account of where she worked in your home?" Margaret Miller, a thin woman with anxious eyes, nodded. "Yes, she worked in the kitchen, as she said. I checked her work before she left, and everything was in order." "And did you see her enter any other parts of the house?" Mrs. Miller glanced nervously at her husband. No, Your Honor, only the kitchen and the necessary wants. Did anyone else enter the house during the time Miss Clarke was working there? Holloway continued. Well, yes, Mrs. Miller admitted reluctantly. My sister visited briefly on the second day and the butcher's boy delivered our order. Richard Miller stood again. This is ridiculous. Are you suggesting my wife's sister or the butcher's boy stole my property? I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Miller, Holloway said evenly. I'm gathering facts. Now, is there anyone who wishes to speak on Miss Clarke's behalf? To Nora's surprise, several people stood. Mrs. Peterson was first, declaring firmly that Nora had been nothing but honest and hardworking since arriving in town. Then the elderly schoolteacher, Miss Winters, rose to attest to Nora's good character based on their conversations at the boarding house. Most surprising of all was when Abraham Collins, the blacksmith, cleared his throat and stood. I can't speak directly to this incident, Your Honor, but I can tell you that my boy was accused of stealing coins from Mr. Miller's desk last winter. The coins turned up under Miller's own ledger a week later, but by then my son's reputation had already been damaged. A murmur ran through the crowd. Miller's face darkened with anger. That was different. The boy must have put them back when he realized he'd be caught. The murmuring grew louder. Holloway rapped his gavel for order. Is there anyone else who has relevant information to share? He asked. To everyone's surprise, Tom Peterson, Mrs. Peterson's husband and owner of the town livery, stood up. I recall Mr. Miller accusing one of my stable hands of stealing his watch last fall. Made a big fuss about it, threatened to have the boy arrested. Then found it in his other coat pocket 2 days later. Never did apologize to the boy, who quit and left town over it. The courtroom erupted in conversation. Miller was on his feet, shouting about conspiracies and ingratitude. Marshal Benton tried to restore order while Justice Holloway banged his gavel repeatedly. In the midst of the chaos, Yates noticed Margaret Miller whisper something urgently to her husband, who brushed her off angrily. Making a split-second decision, Yates moved through the crowd to approach Mrs. Miller directly. Madam, he said quietly, is there something you need to tell the justice? She looked up at him with fearful eyes. I can't, she whispered. Richard would never forgive me. But you know something about the snuff box, Yates pressed gently. Mrs. Miller's hands trembled in her lap. He's always losing things, she confessed in a barely audible voice. He drinks in the evenings and then forgets where he puts things. But he never admits it. It's easier to blame others. Mrs. Miller, Yates said, his voice kind but firm, an innocent woman's reputation and future are at stake here. Would you want your own daughter treated this way? Tears welled in her eyes. The commotion in the courtroom had somewhat subsided as Holloway regained control, but everyone was watching the whispered exchange between Yates and Mrs. Miller with intense curiosity. Finally, she stood. Your Honor, she called out, her voice quavering but determined. I need to say something. Holloway nodded encouragingly. Please proceed, Mrs. Miller. The snuff box, she began, avoiding her husband's furious gaze. Richard, when you accused Miss Clarke yesterday, I tried to tell you. I had moved the snuff box when I was dusting your study the day before. I put it in the cabinet with the other silver pieces for polishing. A hush fell over the room. Richard Miller's face went from red to purple. Margaret, what are you saying? I'm saying Miss Clarke couldn't have taken it because it wasn't in your desk drawer when she was in our home, Mrs. Miller continued, gaining strength. I found it this morning when I was preparing to polish the silver, right where I had left it. You found it, Justice Holloway clarified. The snuff box is no longer missing. No, Your Honor, Mrs. Miller confirmed, pulling a small silver box from her reticule. Here it is. The courtroom exploded with talk once more. Justice Holloway had to bang his gavel several times for order. "In light of this new evidence," he declared when quiet was restored, "the charge against Miss Nora Clarke is dismissed." "Miss Clarke, you are free to go with the court's apologies for this inconvenience." Relief flooded through Nora so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Yates was instantly at her side, a steadying presence. "Furthermore," Holloway continued, "I would like to remind everyone present that false accusations are a serious matter. Mr. Miller, while I understand your wife's explanation suggests this was a misunderstanding rather than malicious intent, I strongly advise more caution in the future before involving the law in what proves to be a household oversight." Richard Miller stormed out of the courthouse without another word, but not before giving his wife a look that promised repercussions. Margaret Miller followed more slowly, head bowed. People began to disperse, many stopping to congratulate Nora or shake Yates's hand. Marshal Benton and Deputy Dawson slipped away without acknowledging their error. When the crowd finally thinned, Nora and Yates stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. "It's over," Nora said, the reality of her acquittal still sinking in. "I can hardly believe it." "Justice prevailed," Yates replied, though his expression was troubled. "But I'm concerned about Mrs. Miller." Nora glanced back toward the courthouse. "Her husband seemed very angry. Do you think he'll hurt her?" "I don't know, but I don't like leaving it to chance." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you mind waiting a moment while I speak with Justice Holloway?" "Of course not," Nora agreed readily. Yates disappeared back into the courthouse for several minutes. When he returned, he looked somewhat relieved. "Holloway's going to send the town doctor to the Miller house later today on the pretext of checking on Mrs. Miller's distress during the hearing. It's not perfect, but it should let Miller know people are watching." Nora's eyes softened. "That was thoughtful of you." He shrugged off the praise. "It seemed necessary." After a pause, he added, "What will you do now?" The question caught Nora off guard. In the tension of the hearing, she hadn't thought beyond clearing her name. "I'm not sure. The Millers obviously won't want me finishing their mending. I'll need to find other work quickly." "You could leave Ash Fork," Yates suggested carefully. "Fresh start somewhere else." "I could," Nora acknowledged, studying his expression. "Is that what you'd recommend?" He met her gaze directly. "Not necessarily. You've made some allies here today. The Petersons clearly think highly of you. And there's no shortage of mending to be done in a town like this." They began walking slowly back toward the boarding house, the morning sun warming the air around them. Nora was acutely aware of Yates beside her, this man who had stepped into her life so unexpectedly and changed its course. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you stay in Ash Fork?" Yates looked down the dusty Main Street thoughtfully. "I hadn't planned to. I've been working odd jobs while waiting for word from a ranch owner north of here who might need a foreman." "Oh," Nora said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "When do you expect to hear from him?" "Any day now. His letter should come on tomorrow's stage." They reached the boarding house and paused on the porch, neither quite ready to part ways. Mrs. Peterson appeared at the door, beaming with delight. "I knew you'd be cleared, Miss Clarke. Such nonsense, those accusations. Come in, both of you. I've prepared a special breakfast to celebrate." The breakfast turned into an impromptu gathering as other boarders joined them, along with a few townspeople who had been at the hearing and wanted to express their support. By midday, Nora had received offers of mending work from 3 different families, and an invitation to help Miss Winters with sewing costumes for the school's upcoming pageant. Throughout it all, Yates remained nearby, quietly observing the proceedings. Nora noticed how he positioned himself at the edges of groups, participating but never becoming the center of attention. When the last well-wisher had departed and Mrs. Peterson was busy in the kitchen, Nora found a moment to speak with him privately. "I never properly thanked you," she said. "Not just for standing up for me yesterday, but for everything you did to help prepare for the hearing. I'm in your debt." "There's no debt," Yates assured her. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Nora replied softly. "Most people would have walked past that jailhouse without a second glance. You didn't." A hint of color touched his tan cheeks. "Well, I'm glad it worked out," he said, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I should probably let you rest. It's been a long couple of days for you." "Actually," Nora ventured, "I was wondering if you might show me around Ash Fork properly. I've been here nearly a week but haven't seen much beyond the main street." Surprise flickered in his eyes, followed by something warmer. "I'd be happy to. Though I'm not sure how much guidance I can offer, having only been here 2 weeks myself." "Then we can discover it together," she suggested, a new boldness in her voice that surprised even her. They spent the afternoon exploring the small town and its immediate surroundings. Yates showed her the creek that gave the settlement its name, where clear water flowed between ash trees that provided welcome shade. They visited the small church at the edge of town, its white-painted wooden steeple the tallest structure for miles. As they walked, conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. Nora told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had instilled in her a love of books and learning. When her parents died of influenza 3 years ago, leaving her with modest savings but no other family, she had decided to head west where teaching positions were plentiful. "But you're working as a seamstress instead," Yates observed. Nora nodded. "Teaching positions for women are scarce in small towns and often come with restrictions that I found constraining. In Prescott, they wanted unmarried teachers to live with a respectable family who would report on their moral conduct." Her lips curved in a wry smile. "I prefer my independence." "Even when it makes life harder?" Yates asked. "Especially then," she answered with quiet conviction. "Freedom is worth the cost," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My father used to say something similar. He was a wanderer at heart, never stayed in one place long. Drove my mother to distraction sometimes, but she loved his free spirit too much to try changing him." "And you inherited that wanderlust?" Nora asked, noting how he spoke of his parents in the past tense. "Some of it," Yates admitted. "After my mother died, there wasn't much to keep me in one place. My father had already passed the year before. I worked ranches from Texas to Montana, never settling for long. Until now," Nora couldn't help asking. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. "I haven't settled yet." "But you're considering a permanent position as a foreman," she pointed out. "True," he acknowledged. "Maybe I'm finally ready to put down some roots, or maybe the right opportunity just came along at the right time." They had reached a ridge overlooking the town, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley below. In the distance, the faint silhouette of mountains shimmered in the heat haze. "It's beautiful in its own harsh way," Nora observed, taking in the vista. "The West demands respect," Yates replied. "It's unforgiving to the careless or unprepared, but it rewards those willing to work with it rather than against it." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the only sounds the gentle rustle of grass in the breeze and the distant lowing of cattle. "We should head back," Yates finally said. "Sun will be setting soon and these paths get treacherous in the twilight." The walk back to town was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Peterson informed them that a message had arrived for Yates from the Peterson ranch. "Not relation to me, mind you," she clarified with a smile. "Just the same name. Seems they need help with a sick horse and wondered if you could come out tonight." Yates frowned slightly at the unexpected request. Did they say how urgent it is? Said the horse is valuable and they're worried, Mrs. Peterson replied. It's their prize stallion, apparently. Then I should go, he decided. It's about an hour's ride. I'll need to fetch my horse from the livery. Will you be back tonight? Nora asked, unable to keep the question inside. Their eyes met briefly. Probably not until morning. Depends on the horse's condition. I understand, she said, though disappointment settled in her chest. Animals can't wait when they're suffering. He hesitated, then added, the stage with my letter should arrive around noon tomorrow. Would you? Would you meet me when it comes in? We could have lunch at the hotel afterward. The invitation lifted her spirits immediately. I'd like that very much. With a nod and a tip of his hat, Yates departed. Nora watched him go, a curious mixture of emotions stirring within her. In just 2 days, this quiet, principled man had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. He's a good one, that Mr. Valentine, Mrs. Peterson remarked, standing beside her in the doorway. Yes, Nora agreed simply. He is. The next morning dawned clear and hot, typical for late June in Arizona territory. Nora rose early, her thoughts immediately turning to Yates and their planned meeting at noon. She dressed with particular care, selecting her blue dress with white piping and taking extra time with her hair, pinning it in a style that framed her face attractively while remaining modest. The morning passed slowly as she helped Mrs. Peterson with household chores and began a small mending project for one of the other boarders. By 11:30, she could no longer concentrate on her sewing and decided to head to the stage depot early. The main street was busy with the usual weekday commerce. Nora nodded politely to those she passed, noting how different the greetings were today, respectful rather than suspicious or indifferent. Word of her vindication had clearly spread. As she neared the stage depot, Nora spotted a familiar figure already waiting on the platform. Yates had returned from the ranch earlier than expected. He stood with his back to her, tall and straight in his worn leather vest, watching the road that led into town from the east. She was about to call out to him when she noticed 2 other men approaching him from behind. With a jolt, she recognized Marshal Benton and Deputy Dawson. Their stance and expressions set alarm bells ringing in her mind. Quickening her pace, Nora reached the edge of the platform just as Benton's voice rang out. Valentine, got some questions for you. Yates turned slowly, his face impassive as he regarded the lawmen. Marshal, Deputy, what can I do for you? Benton stepped closer, invading Yates's personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. Heard you were out at the Peterson ranch last night. That's right, Yates confirmed calmly. They had a sick horse that needed attention. Funny coincidence, Benton said, though his tone suggested he found nothing humorous about it. Because this morning, Peterson reported that his lockbox was broken into, $60 in cash missing. Nora's heart dropped as she realized what was happening. She moved forward, about to protest, when Yates caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. That is a coincidence, Yates agreed evenly. Have you spoken with everyone who was at the ranch yesterday? We're talking to you now, Deputy Dawson cut in, his hand hovering near his holster. Peterson says you were left alone in the house while everyone was out in the barn with that horse. For about 10 minutes, yes, Yates acknowledged. Mrs. Peterson asked me to fetch some herbs from the kitchen shelf while she stayed with the horse. Benton's eyes narrowed. Convenient time to check for valuables, wasn't it? I didn't take any money, Marshal, Yates stated firmly. And I'm sure you know that making accusations without evidence is problematic, especially after yesterday's events. The reference to the Miller fiasco clearly angered Benton. Don't get smart with me, Valentine. You're a drifter with no ties to this community. easy to point fingers when trouble follows. "And what is your evidence, Marshal?" Nora interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. "Besides your obvious dislike of Mr. Valentine," Benton glared at her. "Stay out of this, Miss Clarke. One brush with the law should have taught you to mind your own business." "Actually," came a new voice, "I believe this is everyone's business if you're making public accusations." Justice Holloway approached, having witnessed the confrontation from across the street. His scholarly appearance belied a steely determination as he addressed the marshal. "You have a warrant for Mr. Valentine's arrest, Marshal Benton." Benton shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet, but Peterson's certain. Then I suggest you gather actual evidence before accosting citizens in public," Holloway interrupted. "We've had quite enough of hasty accusations in this town." The tension in the air was palpable. Dawson's fingers still hovered near his gun, and Benton's face had turned an unhealthy shade of red. Before anyone could speak again, the distant rumble of the approaching stagecoach drew their attention. "That'll be the noon stage from Prescott," Holloway observed mildly. "Perhaps we should all step back and allow the passengers to disembark without witnessing a confrontation." Reluctantly, Benton backed away. "This isn't over, Valentine," he muttered. "I've got my eye on you." As the lawman retreated, Yates turned to Nora with concern. "You shouldn't have intervened. Benton won't forget that." "Just as you shouldn't have intervened for me," she countered. "I won't stand by while someone is falsely accused, especially when that someone is you." The stagecoach rolled into town in a cloud of dust, drawing a small crowd of onlookers. The driver called out a greeting as he pulled the team to a stop, then climbed down to open the door for his passengers. 3 people disembarked: a well-dressed businessman, a young woman who was immediately greeted by waiting relatives, and a weathered older man who Nora guessed was a rancher based on his attire. The driver then reached into the message pouch and began sorting letters. "Valentine," he called out. "Got something for you." Yates stepped forward to receive the letter, examining the handwriting on the envelope with an unreadable expression. "Is it from the ranch owner?" Nora asked when he returned to her side. He nodded, slipping the unopened letter into his vest pocket. "Jason Thornton of the Triple T Ranch. Aren't you going to read it?" she asked, surprised. "Later," he said simply. Then, with a glance at the retreating figures of Benton and Dawson, he added, "I think our lunch plans might need to wait. We should talk somewhere private." They walked to the small park behind the church, where a few wooden benches offered seating in the shade of cottonwood trees. Once they were settled, Yates explained what had happened at the Peterson ranch. The horse had colic, painful but treatable if caught early. "I was there for about 3 hours, mostly in the barn. Mrs. Peterson did ask me to fetch some peppermint oil from the kitchen at one point, so I was briefly in the house alone." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I never saw a lockbox or went anywhere but the kitchen." "I believe you," Nora said without hesitation. His eyes softened at her immediate trust. "Thank you. But belief won't matter much if Benton decides to arrest me, and after yesterday he's looking for any excuse." "This can't be coincidence," Nora said thoughtfully. "First I'm accused of theft, then you, right after you helped clear my name." "I've been thinking the same thing," Yates agreed. "Either someone has an interest in discrediting both of us, or someone is using theft accusations to distract from something else," Nora finished. They sat in silence for a moment, considering the implications. Finally, Nora asked, "What will you do about the foreman position? Will you still go?" Yates pulled the letter from his pocket, turning it over in his hands. "The Triple T is a good outfit with a solid reputation. It would be steady work, a chance to build something lasting. It sounds like an opportunity you've been waiting for, Nora observed, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. It was, he agreed, his use of the past tense not lost on her. But that was before. Before what? She prompted when he didn't continue. His eyes met hers, more open and vulnerable than she had seen them yet. Before I met someone who made me question whether moving on is what I really want. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Yates. I know it's sudden, he said quickly. We barely know each other. But I feel like a shout from the direction of the main street interrupted him. They both turned to see a young boy running toward them, waving frantically. Mr. Valentine. Miss Clarke, the boy called, skidding to a stop before them out of breath. You gotta come quick. They're arresting Mrs. Miller. What? They exclaimed in unison, immediately rising to their feet. For stealing her husband's money, the boy explained between gasps. Marshall's taking her to jail right now. Exchanging a quick glance of shared concern, Nora and Yates hurried back toward the main street. They arrived to find a small crowd gathered outside the jailhouse. Through the parting onlookers, they could see Margaret Miller being led up the steps by Deputy Dawson, her face tear-streaked and frightened. Richard Miller stood nearby, his expression a mixture of anger and what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Marshal Benton was with him, nodding at whatever Miller was saying. What's happening? Nora asked one of the bystanders. Miller says his wife stole $50 from his desk, the woman replied, her tone suggesting she found the whole situation distasteful. Says he caught her red-handed this morning. This doesn't make sense, Nora murmured to Yates. Why would Mrs. Miller steal from her own household? She wouldn't, Yates replied grimly. Not after standing up to her husband yesterday. This is retaliation. Without hesitation, he strode toward the jailhouse steps, Nora close behind him. As they approached, Miller spotted them and his face darkened. Well, he sneered. If it isn't the drifter and the thief, come to support another criminal. Mrs. Miller isn't a criminal, Nora retorted. And neither are we. This is obviously your revenge for her telling the truth yesterday. Miller's eyes bulged with anger. How dare you, Marshal? Are you going to let this woman slander me in public? Benton stepped forward menacingly. Miss Clarke, I suggest you and your friend move along. This doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, came Justice Holloway's voice as he once again appeared on the scene. If you're arresting a citizen of Ash Fork, Marshal, I believe I should be present to ensure proper procedure is followed. She confessed, Benton claimed. Miller caught her with the money in hand. Did she confess to you directly, Marshal? Holloway pressed. Or is this Mr. Miller's report of a private conversation? Benton's hesitation was answer enough. Holloway turned to the deputy, who was still holding Mrs. Miller's arm at the top of the steps. Deputy Dawson, please bring Mrs. Miller back down. I'd like to hear from her directly. Now see here, Miller blustered. This is my wife. I have the right to press charges if she steals from me. Indeed you do, Holloway agreed calmly. And she has the right to give her account before being imprisoned. Reluctantly, Dawson led Mrs. Miller back down the steps. The woman looked utterly defeated, her normally neat appearance disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Mrs. Miller, Holloway said gently, your husband accuses you of stealing $50 from his desk. Is this true? She glanced fearfully at her husband before answering in a barely audible voice. No, Your Honor, I was retrieving money from our household funds to pay the butcher. Lies. Miller exploded. That money was from my business account, not household expenses. And where do you keep these separate funds, Mr. Miller? Holloway inquired. In my desk, of course, Miller replied impatiently. Different drawers. A murmur ran through the crowd at this admission. Holloway raised an eyebrow. So Mrs. Miller was accessing money from a desk that contains both household and business funds, and the dispute is over which drawer she opened. Miller's face flushed. She knows which drawer is which. She deliberately took from my business account. Did you, Mrs. Miller? Holloway asked directly. No, Your Honor, she insisted, a hint of strength returning to her voice. I took it from the household drawer as I do every week to pay our bills. Holloway turned to Benton. Marshal, this appears to be a domestic disagreement rather than a criminal matter. I suggest you release Mrs. Miller into my custody while we sort this out. Now wait just a minute, Miller protested. You can't just— Actually, I can, Holloway interrupted firmly. As Justice of the Peace, I have authority to determine whether an arrest is warranted. In this case, I find insufficient evidence of criminal intent. Benton looked ready to argue but was clearly reluctant to challenge Holloway's legal authority in front of the town. With visible reluctance, he nodded to Dawson to release Mrs. Miller. This isn't over, Miller snarled, pointing an accusing finger at his wife, then at Yates and Nora. None of you will get away with this. As he stormed off, Holloway gently guided Mrs. Miller aside. Are you all right, madam? She nodded shakily. Yes, but I can't go home. Richard is. He's not himself lately. Ever since his business deal with Marshal Benton went sour, he's been drinking more and blaming everyone around him for his troubles. Business deal, Yates repeated, his interest piqued. What kind of business deal? Mrs. Miller hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. They've been buying land near where the railroad survey is happening. Richard says they'll make a fortune when the new spur line comes through, but they need more capital to secure the best parcels. The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Nora. And they've been using theft accusations to distract from their own activities, she realized aloud. First it was about discrediting potential witnesses or rivals, but now they're trying to create fictitious crimes to explain where they're getting extra money. Or where money is going missing, Yates added thoughtfully. The Peterson Ranch is right in the path of the most likely route for that railroad spur. Justice Holloway's expression had grown increasingly serious during this exchange. Mrs. Miller, would you be willing to make a formal statement about your husband's business dealings with Marshal Benton? She wrung her hands anxiously. I don't know details, just what I've overheard, and Richard would never forgive me. Your husband just tried to have you jailed, Nora reminded her gently. You owe him no loyalty after that. Mrs. Miller's shoulders slumped in defeat and acceptance. You're right. I'll tell you what I know, Your Honor. Holloway nodded. Good. Let's go to my office where we can speak privately. He turned to Yates and Nora. I believe the sheriff from the county seat is arriving tomorrow on his regular visit. This information will be very useful to him. As Holloway led Mrs. Miller away, the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with gossip about the day's events. Nora and Yates found themselves alone in the aftermath, both processing what they had learned. You think Benton and Miller are behind the theft at the Peterson Ranch? Nora asked as they walked slowly away from the jailhouse. It seems likely, Yates replied. Either to frame me or to cover up their own activities there. Either way, it connects to their land scheme. They paused at the corner of the street, the midday sun beating down mercilessly on the dusty thoroughfare. Despite the day's tension, Nora felt oddly exhilarated by the unfolding events and their shared role in them. We never did get to have that lunch, she noted with a small smile. Yates's expression softened. No, we didn't, and I never finished what I was saying in the park. About questioning whether you wanted to move on, she prompted, her heart quickening. He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. The Triple T Ranch is a good opportunity, but there might be reasons to stay in Ash Fork that are more compelling. Such as? Nora asked, needing to hear him say it. such as a remarkable woman who stands up for justice even when it puts her at risk," Yates said softly. "A woman I'd like to know better if she's willing." Joy bubbled up within Nora, but before she could respond, a shout from down the street caught their attention. They turned to see Deputy Dawson running toward them, his face flushed with exertion. "Valentine," he called. "Justice Holloway wants to see you right away, says it's urgent." Exchanging a concerned look with Nora, Yates nodded. "We'll be right there." They followed Dawson back to Holloway's office, where they found the justice deep in conversation with a man Nora recognized as the rancher who had arrived on the noon stage. "Ah, Mr. Valentine, Miss Clarke," Holloway greeted them. "This is Sheriff Randall from the county seat. He's arrived a day early, which is fortuitous given our situation." Sheriff Randall, a solid man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed gray beard, nodded to them. "Justice Holloway's been filling me in on the unusual number of theft accusations in Ash Fork lately. And Mrs. Miller's statement about her husband's land dealings with your marshal raises serious concerns. We were just discussing that ourselves," Yates said. "It seems Benton and Miller have been using false accusations to manipulate property matters related to the railroad survey. That fits with some reports I've received from other communities," the sheriff confirmed. "There's been land speculation all along the proposed route, some of it using questionable tactics. But what you're describing here goes beyond unethical into potentially criminal behavior." Holloway cleared his throat. "The reason I asked for you specifically, Mr. Valentine, is that Sheriff Randall needs to question Marshal Benton and examine certain records, but we're concerned about tipping our hand too early." "You need a distraction," Yates surmised. "In a manner of speaking," Holloway agreed. "The marshal is currently fixated on you as a suspect in the Peterson Ranch theft. If you were to make yourself visible in town while remaining obviously not in custody, it might keep his attention divided." Nora frowned. "You're asking Yates to paint a target on himself. That seems unnecessarily dangerous." "Not a target," Sheriff Randall assured her. "Just a decoy. I need about 2 hours to execute a search warrant for Benton's office and Miller's business records. If Valentine is seen going about normal business in town during that time, Benton will be watching him instead of noticing our activities." Yates considered the request. "I'm willing to help, but I won't put Nora in danger." "Actually," Holloway said with a slight smile, "we thought Miss Clarke's involvement would make the scenario more believable. The two of you having lunch at the hotel dining room, perhaps. Very public, very ordinary. The kind of thing Benton would find suspicious under the circumstances, but couldn't reasonably interrupt without causing a scene." Nora and Yates exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Yates nodded. "We can do that." "Excellent," Sheriff Randall said, standing and adjusting his gun belt. "I'll have 2 deputies with me, positioned strategically. You won't be without protection." As they left Holloway's office, Yates took Nora's elbow gently. "You don't have to do this if you're uncomfortable," he told her quietly. She smiled up at him, placing her hand over his. "I believe I was promised lunch, Mr. Valentine. I intend to collect on that debt." An answering smile touched his lips. "Then allow me to escort you to the hotel dining room, Miss Clarke." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Ash Fork, though that wasn't saying much by Eastern standards. Still, the tables were covered with clean linens, the silverware polished to a respectable shine, and the menu offered more variety than the usual fare at the boarding house. They were seated at a table near the front window, visible to anyone passing on the street exactly as planned. The waitress, a young woman named Sarah who had been at the hearing the day before, greeted them warmly. "It's nice to see you both," she said sincerely. "Especially together. The whole town's talking about how you stood up to the marshal, Mr. Valentine." "I just asked a question," Yates demurred. "Nothing heroic about that." "Well, I think it was brave," Sarah insisted. "And then helping Miss Clarke clear her name, it's like something from a dime novel." After she took their orders and departed, Nora raised an eyebrow. "A dime novel hero, are you? Should I be impressed?" Yates looked embarrassed. "People romanticize the simplest actions out here. Stand up to a bully once and suddenly you're Wyatt Earp." "I don't think it's that simple," Nora countered. "You've shown real courage, Yates. Not the flashy kind that dime novels celebrate, but the quiet kind that does what's right even when it's difficult." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, but pleased nonetheless. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as their food arrived: roast beef for Yates and chicken pie for Nora. They were halfway through the meal when Nora noticed Deputy Dawson walking past the window for the third time, glancing in as he passed. "I believe we're under surveillance," she murmured, taking a sip of her water. Yates nodded slightly. "Benton himself rode past about 10 minutes ago. They're keeping tabs on us as expected." "I hope the sheriff is making good use of the distraction," Nora said. "I'm sure he is." Yates hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the letter he'd received earlier. "Since we have time to fill, perhaps I should read this." Nora watched as he opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. His expression remained neutral as he read, giving no indication of the letter's contents. "Well," she prompted when he had finished. "What did Mr. Thornton say?" Yates refolded the letter carefully. "He's offering me the position. Good pay, a cabin of my own on the property, and a share in the yearly profits if I stay at least 3 years. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity," Nora said, striving to keep disappointment from her voice. "When would you need to leave?" "Within the week," he replied, studying her face. "He's eager to have the position filled before Roundup starts next month." Nora nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm happy for you. It's clearly the chance you've been waiting for." Yates didn't respond immediately, his eyes never leaving hers. Finally, he said softly, "There are other opportunities I've been considering more seriously of late." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Such as?" Before he could answer, a commotion erupted outside. They turned to see Sheriff Randall and his deputies marching Marshal Benton down the street in handcuffs, followed by a grim-faced Justice Holloway. A crowd was gathering quickly, drawn by the unprecedented sight of their own lawmen under arrest. Yates tossed some coins on the table. "We should find out what's happening." They joined the growing assembly outside the jailhouse, where Sheriff Randall was addressing the townspeople. "Citizens of Ash Fork," he announced in a carrying voice, "I've placed Marshal Benton under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of his official position. We've uncovered evidence that he and Richard Miller have been using intimidation and false accusations to manipulate land sales related to the upcoming railroad development." A buzz of shock and outrage swept through the crowd. Someone called out, "What about Miller?" "Mr. Miller is also being sought for questioning," Randall confirmed. "If anyone knows his current whereabouts, please step forward." No one did, though whispered conversations suggested Miller had been seen riding out of town shortly after his confrontation at the jailhouse earlier. "In the meantime," Randall continued, "I'm appointing a temporary marshal to maintain order until a permanent replacement can be selected. Mr. Peterson, as a respected business owner, would you be willing to serve in this capacity?" Tom Peterson, who had been standing near the front of the crowd, looked surprised but nodded his agreement. "I'd be honored, Sheriff." As the crowd began to disperse, Sheriff Randall approached Nora and Yates. "Thank you for your help," he said sincerely. Your distraction worked perfectly. Benton was so busy having you watched that he never noticed us searching his office. What evidence did you find? Yates asked. Ledgers showing payments to Benton from Miller corresponding with dates when thieves were arrested, Randall explained. And maps marking properties they were targeting, including the Peterson Ranch. We also found the $50 Miller accused his wife of stealing hidden in Benton's desk. And the money supposedly stolen from the Peterson Ranch, Nora inquired. No sign of that yet, Randall admitted. But we did find a key that matches their lockbox. Benton likely used it to stage the theft and planned to plant the money on Valentine here when he arrested him. Justice Holloway joined them, looking weary but satisfied. It's been a long day, but justice has been served. Mrs. Miller has agreed to stay with Miss Winters until this matter is resolved. She's provided valuable information about her husband's activities. What happens now? Nora asked. Benton will be taken to the county seat for trial, Randall said. We'll continue searching for Miller, though my guess is he's halfway to Mexico by now. And the town? Yates inquired. Holloway sighed. Ash Fork will recover. Communities out here are resilient by necessity. Mr. Peterson will make a fine temporary marshal, and the railroad will still come through eventually, bringing new opportunities without the taint of corruption. As the afternoon waned, Nora and Yates found themselves once again walking together through town, processing the day's dramatic events. The air had cooled slightly with the approaching evening, bringing welcome relief from the heat. It's hard to believe so much has happened in just 3 days, Nora remarked as they strolled past the general store, where the proprietor was already posting a notice about the marshal's arrest in the window. The West compresses time, Yates observed. Lives change in an instant out here for better or worse. They reached the small park behind the church where their earlier conversation had been interrupted. By unspoken agreement, they returned to the same bench, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You never finished telling me about the opportunities you've been considering, Nora said after a comfortable silence. Besides the Triple T Ranch. Yates turned slightly to face her, his expression more open than she had seen it yet. When I came to Ash Fork, I was just passing through, waiting for word about a job that would give me stability but still let me keep my distance from people. It seemed like the perfect balance. And now, she prompted gently. Now I'm wondering if distance is really what I want anymore, he admitted. If maybe there's something to be said for connections, community, roots. That's quite a change in perspective for a wanderer, Nora noted, her heart beating faster. It is, he agreed. And it's happened because of you, Nora. In 3 days, you've made me question everything I thought I wanted. She searched his face, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. What are you saying, Yates? I'm saying I don't want to leave, he replied simply. Not unless you're coming with me. You barely know me, she whispered, though her heart sang at his words. I know enough, he countered. I know you're brave and principled. I know you stand up for others even at risk to yourself. I know you make me want to be better, to do better. And I know I've never felt this way about anyone before. Nora's eyes filled with tears. I feel it too, she confessed. But what about the foreman position? It's the opportunity you've been waiting for. Yates reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. There are other ranches, other jobs, but there's only one you. So you'll stay in Ash Fork, she asked, hope rising within her. If you will, he replied. Or we could go somewhere else together, start fresh where no one knows us. What matters to me is that we'd be facing whatever comes next side by side. Nora had spent 3 years making her own way in the world, fiercely guarding her independence. The idea of linking her future to someone else's, would have seemed unthinkable just days ago. But looking into Yates's earnest blue eyes, she felt not constraint but possibility, the freedom to build something meaningful with a man who valued her strength rather than seeking to diminish it. "I'd like that," she said softly, "to face the future together." His smile transformed his face, erasing the habitual gravity and replacing it with a joy so radiant it nearly took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers, a gentle, questioning kiss that held both promise and respect. When they parted, Nora couldn't help smiling. Mrs. Peterson was right. The town will have us married off by supper time. Yates laughed, the sound rich and unexpectedly youthful. For once, the gossips might be on the right track. Not immediately, of course. "We should take time to know each other properly, but eventually." "Eventually," Nora agreed, her hand still held in his. "I like the sound of that." As the sun began to set over Ash Fork, casting long shadows and painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Yates and Nora remained on their bench, talking of possibilities, of dreams long set aside that might now be rekindled, of a future neither had imagined 3 days ago, when fate had brought them together in the doorway of a jailhouse. 2 months later, Ash Fork had settled into a new rhythm. Tom Peterson had been officially appointed as marshal after serving ably in the temporary position. Richard Miller had been apprehended trying to cross into Mexico and brought back to face charges alongside former Marshal Benton. The town had rallied around Margaret Miller, who had filed for divorce, a scandalous but increasingly supported decision given the circumstances. Nora had established herself as the town's premier seamstress, with a small but growing business that now included making dresses as well as repairs. She had moved from the boarding house into a modest apartment above the dress shop she rented on Main Street, her independence intact but no longer isolating. Yates had declined the position at the Triple T Ranch, instead accepting an offer to manage the Peterson Ranch, where his knowledge of horses had proven invaluable during the crisis with their prize stallion. The role kept him close to town while allowing him to work outdoors with the animals and land he understood so well. On a bright September morning, Nora stood in her shop, pinning a hem for Mrs. Collins, the blacksmith's wife, when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see Yates entering, his hat in his hands and a nervous energy about him that immediately caught her attention. "Good morning, ladies," he greeted them politely. "Mrs. Collins, would you mind terribly if I stole Miss Clarke away for a few minutes? I have something important to discuss with her." Mrs. Collins smiled knowingly. "Not at all, Mr. Valentine. This fitting can wait." With a wink at Nora, she added, "Take all the time you need, dear." Once they were alone, Nora approached Yates with curious concern. "Is everything all right? You seem nervous." "Not nervous," he clarified, "just determined." He took a deep breath. "Nora, these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, spending time together, building something here in Ash Fork, it's more than I ever thought I'd have." Her heart began to race as she sensed the direction of his words. "They've been wonderful months for me too," she said softly. "I promised we'd take time, and we have," he continued. "But I find myself more certain with each passing day that what I felt that first week wasn't just the excitement of the moment. It was recognition of someone I could build a life with, someone I could love completely." From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "I rode to Prescott yesterday to get this," he explained, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring with a single diamond that caught the morning light. "Nora Clarke, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need me or I need you, but because together we're better than we are apart." Tears of joy sprang to Nora's eyes. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. Yes, Yates Valentine, I will marry you. His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a tender embrace. I love you, Nora, he whispered against her hair. And I love you, she replied, marveling at how natural those words felt, words she had never expected to say to any man. Their wedding took place in October, with the cottonwood trees displaying their golden autumn foliage against a crystal-clear blue sky. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church filled to capacity, as Justice Holloway performed the ceremony. Mrs. Peterson wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing to happen in Ash Fork since her own wedding 30 years earlier. Miss Winters smiled approvingly, having played matchmaker subtly but persistently throughout the summer. Even the new railroad surveyor, who had replaced the corrupt partnership's chosen man, attended with congratulations and news that the spur line would indeed be coming through town the following year. As Nora and Yates exchanged their vows, she thought back to that fateful day in June when two men had dragged her toward injustice, and a cowboy had blocked the door with 3 simple words that changed everything. On what charge? What had begun as an act of principled intervention had blossomed into the deepest love either of them had known, a love founded on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. After the ceremony, they rode in an open carriage to the Peterson Ranch, where a celebration had been arranged under a canopy of lantern-lit trees. As the music played and friends offered toasts to their happiness, Yates led Nora away from the festivities for a moment of privacy. Happy, Mrs. Valentine? He asked, his arms encircling her waist. Incredibly so, she confirmed, reaching up to touch his face. And not just because of today. Happy because of all the days to come, whatever they may bring. Whatever they bring, we'll face it together, he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that spoke of devotion, partnership, and a future brighter than either had dared to imagine before chance and courage had brought them together on the steps of the Ash Fork jailhouse. In the years that followed, Ash Fork grew and prospered with the coming of the railroad. Yates eventually purchased the Peterson Ranch when the older couple decided to retire, building it into one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the territory. Nora's dress shop expanded to include a successful mail-order business serving remote ranches and homesteads throughout the region. They welcomed their first child, a son named Thomas, in the autumn of 1882, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth. Their home became known for its warmth and hospitality, open to travelers and neighbors alike. Sometimes, when visitors asked how they had met, Nora and Yates would exchange a private smile before one of them would begin the tale. Well, it all started when 2 men were dragging her to the justice, and a cowboy blocked the door and said, "On what charge?" And as they told the story of false accusations and true courage, of justice prevailed, and love discovered they would hold hands, still marveling at how 3 simple words had changed the course of their lives forever. For Yates Valentine and Nora Clarke, that fateful confrontation on the jailhouse steps had been not an ending but a beginning, the first page in a love story that would continue to unfold, chapter by chapter, through all the seasons of their shared life in the wild Arizona territory they had made their home.